Minister Lawrence Wong.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I thank the members of the House who have risen in support of the bill, as well as the members who have shared their comments and feedback. I will now address some of the points raised in the course of this debate. I believe members who have spoken generally agreed that as a responsible member of the international community, there is a need for Singapore to do our part to strengthen our levers to effectively detect, deter, and prevent money laundering and terrorism financing. However, several members, including Engineer Dr. Lee Biwa and Ms. Fumi Ah, asked why developers? Is there a need to impose these requirements on developers in particular, since the funds they receive would eventually have to pass through financial institutions and banks who already have to carry out checks anyway? Engineer Dr. Lee is right that in general, most money laundering and terrorism financing activities are concentrated in the financial sectors. But as Ms. Fumi Ah and Mr. Lewis Ng said, real estate is also an established method of money laundering worldwide. And so such activities can occur in real estate, and real estate can be exposed to questionable practices and used as a vehicle for money laundering and terrorism financing activities. For the real estate sector in particular, besides your bankers and lawyers, developers are a key party that deal with property buyers. So they do play an important role in the detection and prevention of such activities, and that's why we are introducing these requirements by amending the two acts that regulate developers to better facilitate our anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing activities. And this is also the reason why this bill does not cover transactions involving completed properties, because the bill pertains to the two acts that regulate the sale of uncompleted housing and commercial properties by developers. These are the sale of properties typically sold off-plan, and they are exposed to more risk. And our main objective of the bill is to get developers who are involved in the sale of such uncompleted properties involved in our anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing efforts, and to bring them up to the same level as the other players that are involved in real estate transactions, namely the bankers and the lawyers. For the sale of completed properties, which these typically do not involve developers directly, and so we rely on the other players in the real estate chain, such as bankers and lawyers who already have similarly robust obligations under their respective legislation to conduct customer due diligence checks and to report suspicious transactions. So this is really about leveling up and making sure that we cover comprehensively the same requirements, not just on bankers, not just on lawyers, but also now on real estate developers, and that's why the bill covers the two acts that regulate the sale of uncompleted properties. For real estate agents in particular, CEA currently has guidelines to require estate agents to perform due diligence checks for suspicious transactions. These are guidelines by the regulator. However, we do intend to make amendments next year to the Estate Agents Act so as to impose similar anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing requirements for estate agents. I understand and I hear the feedback from the members who have spoken, all of you have highlighted and asked if the proposed legislation would be overly onerous on developers and whether it would impact their business operations. We share the concerns, and that's why in drafting the provisions and in implementing these requirements, we have been careful to implement a calibrated risk-based approach. So in tabling this bill, we would like to strike a balance between complying with the requirements recommended by the FATF and ensuring that the burden on developers is not excessive. And that's why, as I mentioned earlier, the bill adopts a risk-based approach under which the broad principal obligations are set out, and that's why, perhaps why Mr. Lewis Ng noted that there are these terminologies which are set out in very broad language, but it is deliberately done so that then businesses have the flexibility to develop procedures according to their business size, customer profile and nationality, and different levels of money laundering and terrorism risk, financing risks, which they can identify using their own AML or CTF programs. Engineer Dr. Lee, for example, talked about the 12-month deadline when due diligence checks are to be conducted. These are not hard-coded in the bill. These are more detailed regulations that would be set out in subsidiary legislation, and we have not decided on them yet. So we will take the time to engage the industry and review these specific requirements before we set them out in subsidiary legislation. That said, I would like to highlight that developers today already collect most of the Know Your Customer, KYC information that we have in mind for the rules. Right? Developers today already do so. Any developer that accepts a transaction without doing basic KYC checks, I think, will be problematic even today. So I would expect developers today to already collect most of the KYC information that we have in mind for the rules, such as identity documentation. So the incremental compliance costs should not be excessive and should not adversely affect purchases, especially genuine purchases. Engineer Dr. Lee asked how long developers will have to keep records of their diligence checks. The prescribed period will be set out in the rules and will be at least 5 years after the completion of the transaction. And this is consistent with what is prescribed in the FATF recommendations and also in other sectors' legislations, such as for financial institutions and for pawnbrokers. Some members asked about the extent of the developers' responsibilities in adhering to the requirements of the new bill. I think specifically Mr. Gantiampo asked about the point at which the developer's duty to monitor the buyers ends, given that the profile of buyers can change after the signing of the sales and purchase agreement. Under the new Section 12B of the Housing Developers Control and Licensing Act and the new Section 5A2 of the Sale of Commercial Properties Act, so under these new requirements, a developer is required to perform such customer due diligence measures as may be prescribed at such times as may be prescribed. So the provisions are broad, but I want to assure members that we will not be requiring developers to monitor their buyers perpetually. Instead, the rules will make clear that the requirements on developers will only apply until the project is completed, which is also the point at which the developer is no longer regulated under the two acts. Developers should ensure that the information obtained with respect to the purchasers and its beneficial owners are kept updated. At any point during the monitoring, if the developer comes to know about property which represents proceeds of or is used or intended to be used in connection with any act which may constitute drug dealing or criminal conduct, the developer will then have to report such suspicious activity to a suspicious transaction reporting officer. But the point is that the rules will not be imposed on the developer perpetually. Ms. Fu Miha asked if developers could rely on third parties such as estate agents, lawyers or banks to conduct the necessary checks on their behalf. Answer is yes. Right? Developers will have the flexibility to determine how best to do their checks, including through third parties. As mentioned, we are adopting a calibrated risk-based approach to compliance, and we will not rule out the use of such third parties, but ultimately the developer bears full responsibility for adhering to the requirements under this new bill. So the developer should ensure that the third party it hires has the appropriate capabilities and the resources to comply with these measures and are able to provide the relevant information to the developers without delay upon request, should they decide to use a third party. Engineer Dr. Lee and Mr. Louis Ng asked who specifically would be held responsible if the due diligence measures were found to be inadequate or not complied with. And Ms. Fu also asked about the need for the burden of compliance to fall on senior management and throughout the organization for accountability. Indeed, the developer will be primarily responsible for failing to perform any due diligence measures as required by law. However, where the offense was committed with the consent or connivance of an officer of the company, or the commission of the offense was attributable to the officer's negligence, then that officer may also be held liable for the offense. So it would really depend on a case-by-case basis, depending on the circumstance. That officer could be any director, member of the management team, CEO, manager, secretary, or other persons acting in such capacity in the developer company. And this is also the position taken today under Section 27 of the Housing and Developers Control and Licensing Act and Section 9 of the Sale of Commercial Properties Act. Engineer Lee asked about the role of the compliance officer that developers must appoint. This compliance officer can be any appointee at the management level and will be responsible for reviewing the developer's anti-money laundering and terrorism financing policy. So it need not result in additional expense, but the developer must designate a compliance officer and appoint with clear responsibilities for this officer. Ms. Fu asked how developers can mitigate the risk brought on by the use of shell companies and other corporate entities to purchase property. Indeed, the government is aware of such concerns, and we have made legislative amendments to address this issue. For example, the Companies Act was amended last year to make the ownership and control of business entities more transparent and thereby reduce opportunities for the misuse of corporate entities for illicit purchases or purposes. The FATF recommendations also include requirements for regulated entities to obtain information of beneficial ownership. So in elaborating and crafting the rules, we will make clear the duties of developers in this particular requirement of checking for beneficial ownership as well. Some members expressed concern that developers would fail to effectively comply with the new rules due to a lack of understanding of how to implement them, or merely go through the motions. And indeed, we do not want this to be a paper exercise or a tick-in-the-box exercise, as some of the members have mentioned just now. So we will be adopting a two-pronged approach to address this. First, we want to help developers level up. So URA will engage the developers, we will do industry outreach and provide all the necessary guidance to developers in the initial implementation stage. Subsequently, URA will provide ongoing support to improve the industry's understanding of what constitutes risky transactions, as well as the risk mitigation capabilities that are needed in order to foster a good understanding of the new requirements. Then when the industry's capabilities are leveled up, when everything is in motion, the controller of housing under URA will carry out regular audit checks to ensure that indeed developers are implementing the measures properly. And if developers are found to not have adhered to the requirements, there will be penalties, not only potential fines, but in more serious cases, they could also be disqualified from obtaining licenses in the future. Let me now move on to some transboundary issues which members have raised. Mr. Gunn asked how whether other countries have implemented similar regulations, how many, and if there's a level playing field. Indeed, the whole point of developing international standards under FATF is to ensure that there is a comprehensive global system to fight against money laundering and terrorism financing. And to date, about 190 jurisdictions have committed to the FATF recommendations. The specific provisions may differ from country to country, because even the regulation of the sale of properties vary from country to country. Some countries even prohibit sale of properties off plan. Right? So specific provisions may vary, but 190 jurisdictions have committed to the FATF recommendations precisely because this is an important international issue and we can only make progress through a global effort. Mr. Gunn also asked if we can deny or revoke a housing developer's license to persons or entities that have been convicted of money laundering or terrorism financing offences in other jurisdictions. We will mainly rely on local convictions as a basis to refuse, suspend or revoke a housing developer's license, but the controller may refuse to grant a license to a person or entity with an overseas conviction or revoke the license if it has been earlier granted if the overseas conviction, together with other circumstances, indicate that it is carrying on its business in Singapore in a manner that is detrimental to the interests of purchasers or the public. So we have the ability to do so, to revoke or suspend or refuse a license if the convictions are happening elsewhere. Finally, Mr. Louis Ng suggested for the government to consider adopting unexplained wealth legislation to bolster our anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing regime. This is, in fact, a point raised by Mr. Murali Pillay yesterday during the debate on the Serious Crimes and Counter-Terrorism Bill. So it's, in fact, not quite so relevant to this bill. Because as mentioned by Minister Josephine Teo yesterday, the government will certainly monitor overseas developments in the area of anti-corruption measures to see if these can be adapted here on another occasion. Unexplained wealth order legislation has been introduced overseas as an investigation tool to enable enforcement agencies to investigate the source of money. But it is a tool which can and should be capable of being directed at anyone, not just developers. So it's really a separate matter outside of the scope of this bill. Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, I believe I've addressed the points raised by members. This bill is just one of the many changes we are making to our laws to help Singapore be a responsible member of the international community and to uphold our reputation as a conducive and reputable place to do business. Failure to impose these anti-money laundering and terrorism financing requirements across our entire real estate value chain comes at a reputational cost to Singapore. And I believe that legislative backing will be necessary to ensure effective enforcement and compliance to these requirements. Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, I beg to move.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. Aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
The Developers Anti Money Laundering and Terrorism Financing Bill.
Committee stage what day?
Now, sir, I beg to move that Parliament will immediately resolve itself into a committee on the bill.
The question is that Parliament will immediately resolve itself into a committee on the bill. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The question is that clauses 1 to 13 stand part of the bill. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Bill to be reported. Minister.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I beg to report that the bill has been considered in committee and agreed to without amendment.
Third reading what day?
Now, sir, I beg to move that the bill be now read a third time.
The question is that the bill be now read a third time. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. Aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Developers Anti Money Laundering and Terrorism Financing Bill.
Order. I propose to take a break now. I suspend the sitting and we'll take the chair again at 3:55. Order. Order.